Hey everyone, it's Bina 007 here with Vassals of Kingsgrave's Agatha Christie reread. Today we're going to discuss Evil Under the Sun, that was originally published in June 1941, but written pre-war in 1938. So you might get a bit of whiplash after 1-2 Buckle My Shoe, because this novel does not contain any politics or war talk. Today I am joined by Pat.
Hi there, 2.0 in the Discord.
And you guys can all join the Agatha Christie and other pop culture discussions on the Discord by Googling Vassals of Kingsgrave or VOK podcast, which will bring up a link, hopefully, for you to join us. So, Pat, is this your first time reading the novel? Is it a reread? And how do you rate this Hercule Poirot murder mystery?
Okay, first time reading it, but this is one of the Ustinov Poirots that I watched on TV with the family as a kid. So it very much like, I think this must have been played every year about Christmas time for about 10 years. It was like The Great Escape and James Bond movies. It got regularly played and we always sat down and watched it, even though we knew who'd done it. So I would say I like this and I would call it a top tier Christie, but I would say that is mostly probably with Ustinov nostalgia and Poirot's quite touching speech at the end. So those are maybe the two things that I think push it into top tier Christie, because I was actually surprised that it's quite sparse, really, compared to some of the others.
It's not an intricately plotted book with lots of side hustles and red herrings like Death on the Nile, to which it's often compared. For me, it's very bottom of top tier, if not top of middle tier Christie. And I love that Ustinov film, so we'll get into it. And I think that gives me a lot of fondness for this book that it probably doesn't deserve. But I do feel that the characters of Arlena and Linda are particularly well drawn. So I think I read this more for character than plot, which is probably not a good thing with an Agatha Christie.
No.
But I have real fondness for that. That's probably my favorite adaptation, actually, of Agatha Christie, is that Ustinov version of this. So we'll get into that in due course.
Yeah.
Okay, listeners, I was just going to say readers, maybe your readers and listeners. We're going to discuss this spoiler-free to the end credit music and then get into the plot or lack thereof in the after show. So let's start off with a bit of historic context. So apparently this was written in 1938 when she was kind of cranking out 3 or 4 novels that she was publishing a year and keeping a few in reserve. I don't know if you ever got to 1-2 Buckle My Shoe. Does it feel weird to you that this feels so non-wartime, or did you just take it not as having any relationship to that, so whatever?
I've got some thoughts on it, and probably best discussed in the spoiler section. But I think with us reading it so far away from what was actually happening back then, you sort of like just take it on its own terms as a book. It never struck me as unusual that 1-2 Buckle My Shoe was written before this one. Oh, sorry, was published before this one was. So I didn't really take the historical context in it. And I think you've already mentioned it. Unlike maybe about half a dozen of the books around this that we've been reading recently, this doesn't really have a lot of historical context in it. Poirot's Christmas mentioned the Spanish Civil War. We had like the Emirate of Transjordan in Appointment with Death. All these things place it in its historical time. But I don't think there was anything in Evil Under the Sun, or if there was, I've missed it, that sort of like nails it to that period.
Yeah, and in fairness, actually, this is almost still phony war in the UK, and the US isn't at war at all. So maybe we wouldn't expect it. It's really interesting when we get to the novel immediately after this, N or M. That's probably the most heavily wartime of all the books. So I think in retrospect, I hadn't realized it was written until 1938 until I started doing some research. And then I was like, oh, okay, that makes so much more sense. Because actually in theme and concept, it's so similar to Death on the Nile. And I think what we've discovered, or what I've discovered doing this reread, is you can often see groupings of books that she's kind of working an idea out in slightly different ways in 2 or 3 novels, and then moves on to another idea. And I think this is definitely one way you can see she was probably working certain ideas out that appear in other novels, which to me is a negative, because I do think they're worked out better in those other novels. But we'll get into that.
Yeah, but again, it's something for the spoiler section. It comes back to what you were saying about the characterization, though. I do think that Arlena and Rosamund are probably 2 of his stronger sort of female characters, particularly when they're contrasted next to each other.
Yeah, I think this is one of the best books Agatha's written for female characters, including the teenage girl. Okay, so let's get into a little bit of historical context. There's not much, actually, because the prior novel was published in November 40, and this came out in June 41. So in December of 40, Captain America appears in print for the first time.
Hooray.
F. Scott Fitzgerald died, end of an era, end of the Jazz Age, start of the wartime age, maybe. January 1941, Lend-Lease begins. So America, although not in the war, starts basically funding Britain being in the war. And Puerto Ricans became US citizens by birth. In February 41, the USO was created, and the first person was treated by penicillin intravenously. So an age of medical advance. And then in April of 1941, the US destroyer USS Niblack, while picking up survivors from a sunken Dutch freighter, drops depth charges on a German U-boat. So this is the first shot in anger fired by America against Germany, which is really interesting because the US is definitely not in the war at this moment. But I think that and the Lend-Lease shows you which side they're on. Meanwhile, however, in America, the America First Committee holds its first mass rally in New York with Charles Lindbergh as a keynote speaker. So that sort of fringe American sort of nationalist fascist sympathy coming through there. In May 1941, the breakfast cereal Cheerios is introduced. Orson Welles released Citizen Kane. The first defense bonds and defense savings stamps go on sale in the US to fund the greatly increased production of military equipment. Oh, yes, and the Royal Navy captured the German U-boat that had an Enigma crypto machine on it. So this is what's going to then lead to the breakthrough of breaking Enigma code. The Disney animated strike begins, so echoes of today with a WGA strike. And Rudolf Hess parachutes into Scotland claiming to be on a peace mission. Last but not least, in June 1941, all German and Italian assets in the USA are frozen. The US Army Air Corps officially becomes the US Army Air Force, and Operation Barbarossa begins. So it's kind of interesting to me, like looking at those months, most of the information focused on how the US was basically gearing up for war, which was kind of surprising. I didn't realize so much was going on pre-Pearl Harbor, but that was kind of interesting to me.
Yeah, it certainly puts it into context. I mean, I was always on the understanding that FDR had been preparing the US for war from like the late 30s anyway, from like 39. As soon as like war in Europe took off, I always got the feeling he was trying to bring the US in on the Ally side. So
yeah,
but obviously, I think like there's always been, or certainly in that period, there was a very strong isolationist strain in the US.
Well, the Charles Lindbergh speech representing that, I guess, the America First.
Well, yeah, I think like you've mentioned probably a more right wing version, but like even amongst sort of more left wing people, I think there was a sort of a reluctance to get involved in the war, as I suppose there is with most countries. It's not something that people rush towards. So
agree. Well, indeed, many people in England didn't rush towards it. Memories of World War One very strong. Churchill, battling against that, but the mainstream of opinion, I would argue, was one of relief at peace in our time, etc. So
yeah,
absolutely, it was a perfectly respectable opinion to be held. It's just that history proved it to be the wrong opinion, but it's very easy to be wise after the fact, isn't it?
Yes, definitely.
Okay, so let's get into the novel. This is, well, it's not really a closed house mystery. It's sort of like a closed island mystery where Hercule Poirot finds himself on holiday in an island off the coast of England that at certain tides can be accessed, but really is inaccessible except by boat. So a little bit less extreme than And Then There Were None. It's basically a group of people having a holiday in a hotel. And amongst the guests is a very glamorous ex-actress called Arlena, who's now married to Kenneth Marshall. And she is incredibly glamorous. It feels like she's maybe having an affair with another guest called Patrick Redfern. Some of the guests have reason to not like her, including her stepdaughter, Linda, who absolutely hates her and goes to the extent of buying a secondhand book that has some voodoo rituals in it. So she really doesn't like her. But, there are people on the island who are just there having their holiday. Not everyone's a suspect. Both of the films try and make everyone a suspect, but that's actually not the case in the book. Arlena Marshall goes for a little row around the island to an isolated cove. And the key thing about this beach is you can only reach it by boat or by climbing down a ladder to the bay. It's not very easily accessible. She's going for a secret assignation with her lover, but is instead murdered. So the question for Hercule Poirot is, who did it amongst the limited number of guests on the island? Before we get into the characters, maybe a little word on Christieverse. The character of Colonel Weston had originally appeared in Peril at N House, one of Hannah's favourite books. So that's made reference to. And then the minor character, Mrs. Gardner, mentions Death on the Nile and Cornelia Robson in chapter 1 of this novel. So there are some little Christieverse mentions in there. Let's get into the characters. Hercule Poirot, in a Xander-like way, I was trying to find some Hercule Poirotisms. I couldn't really find any. Did you get any? I couldn't find any like really arrogant bits.
Yeah, she used them all up in 1-2 Buckle My Shoe.
Yeah, there were loads in that. I was very disappointed, but he is really the sole detective. We don't have any other sort of, we don't have Inspector Japp or anyone, sadly.
No, we've got Inspector Colgate and Colonel Weston, but I think they're almost there to try and introduce an element of comedy. They're always running like a few steps behind what everybody else is doing.
Yeah, the comic relief almost.
Yeah.
But it's really about the guests on the island. So let's get into the Marshall family, who are really at the core of this. So Captain Kenneth Marshall in his 40s, kind of funny because in the show or the TV show, the movie, he kind of feels a lot older than that, but he's actually quite young, who is Arlena's husband, a sort of, maybe rather old-fashioned gentleman, rather earnest, kind of loyal, I guess. How do you find Kenneth Marshall?
I'm not a big fan of Captain Ken. I don't think he holds up that well. I think he's got like this white knight complex. And as I was reading it, I was thinking, to lose one wife can be regarded as a misfortune, but to lose two looks like carelessness. I was thinking of Lady Bracknell from The Importance of Being Earnest again. I was like, my God, this guy is fatal. Who would ever want to marry him? He's outlived two of his spouses already.
Yeah,
so,
he definitely has a white knight complex. It's implied that he basically marries Arlena because someone else blew her off. And he is very loyal. Like he kind of in one sense knows that the marriage is bad, but he kind of believes in his vows, and it just feels like an imprisonment. He says, dash it all, there's got to be such a thing as good faith. If you marry a woman, engage yourself to look after her. It's up to you to do it. It's your show. You've taken it on. So it's kind of like he sees marriage as kind of taking on property or like taking on the caretaker role. It's really kind of literally patronizing, I guess.
Yes. Yeah, very, 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 very much so.
And then we get to the lovely Arlena Stuart Marshall, who had been a very famous actress. She's been married to Kenneth for the last 4 years. And I think we're meant to think that she's incredibly beautiful. This is the description from Agatha Christie. She was tall and slender. She wore a simple backless white bathing dress, and every inch of her exposed body was tanned a beautiful even shade of bronze. She was as perfect as a statue. Her hair was a rich flaming auburn curling richly and intimately into her neck. Her face had that slight hardness which is seen when 30 years have come and gone. But the whole effect of her was one of youth, of superb and triumphant vitality.
She's obviously the victim, and she's in an incompatible marriage, with a husband who finds her stupid. I think there's no other way of putting it. And I think there is no love there, and she seemed to be carrying on with other men, and I think that comes across very early on. And I don't think it's portrayed in a positive light at the start of it.
Yeah, but
there's
an interesting trick going on, isn't there? Because at the start, I think we're meant to think of her as a bit of a gold digger, a bit of a hussy, just
and certainly
a poor, innocent captain who's taken advantage of. But actually, as the novel goes on, you realise
there's more depth to it. Yeah,
there's way more depth to it. Very much like Death on the Nile, actually, where you're at the start, you hate the spoiled little sort of princessy rich girl who stole her best friend's boyfriend or fiance.
Yeah,
but
and
actually,
then when you
do realise that they're more interesting.
You just moderately dislike her towards the end because you realise that she did have some redeeming features.
Whereas I think Arlena I actually not liked at the end, but I really had sympathy by the end. So I think let's get into that in the spoiler section, but it's really interesting.
Definitely.
Okay, and then to sort of round out that family, we have Linda Marshall, who is Kenneth's 16-year-old daughter by his first marriage, first wife, who really hates her stepmom. Kind of no one really seems to know what to do with her. She's finished school. She's not yet at finishing school. She doesn't want to be sent to Paris, which is where her dad wants to take her. And I think she just feels very sort of, clumsy and in the way, and probably feels rather, that Arlena's taking advantage of her dad. So another interesting character, because it's one of the first times we're really seeing Agatha Christie portray a thing that didn't really exist in kind of social concept yet, a teenager. But I think it's actually a pretty good description. I was thinking of her going to the bookshop and finding the little book on sort of witches' spells and getting the wax candles and kind of childishly trying to create a voodoo doll of her stepmom and thinking, she's kind of like an emo goth teenager who hates her mum. It's very relatable to sort of 60.
This aspect of it has dated, but I think what Christie's captured quite well is this idea of the teenager being awkward in their own skin. They're growing up, things are changing, and they're not sure. And she does communicate that quite well. She talks about Linda being a bit clumsy, and feeling that, her hands aren't doing what she wants them to do all the time, and, being a bit, on edge and surly and things like that.
Dysmorphia during puberty. I mean, I think so many of us would relate to that. And it's kind of amazing to me because Agatha Christie at this point is 51. And yet I think it's a really sympathetic portrait of a teenager, and she gets quite a lot of time in the book, which I like.
Yeah, possibly something that she's written, because she's written this before, hasn't she? And that this character is possibly something she's based off her own experiences with her own daughter, who would have been a teenager not too many years beforehand.
Yeah, exactly. And with whom we know she had a slightly awkward relationship.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's get into some of the other guests at the island. So Patrick and Christine Redfern. So Patrick Redfern is the young, very good-looking man. Agatha Christie describes him as lean, bronzed, with broad shoulders and narrow thighs. There was about him a kind of infectious enjoyment and gaiety. It feels like he's like a movie star. And this is definitely the type of guy that Agatha Christie went for in her young hot days as well. So he's the guy that Arlena's having an affair with. And then there's the weedy, pale wife, Christine, just sort of really kind of like pale and pasty, and the absolute opposite of Patrick and Arlena. She's afraid of heights. She can't get into the sun. She's just an absolute sort of very aware that her husband's having an affair and doesn't like it, but just absolutely stands in contrast.
Yeah, but Poirot does make a comment, doesn't he? He does say she's different from Arlena because she has brains. So, I think Poirot from a very early stage recognizes that Patricia Redfern is Christina Redfern is she's quite clever as well.
And we always know when Poirot notices that she has brains, that's always a very, just as if someone's an actress, that's often significant. If someone has brains, that's often significant.
Yeah, beware of brainy actresses, definitely.
Yeah, exactly. Especially if Agatha Christie is giving us a very precise timeline. Then get very worried about the timeline. This is the advantage of us being on our 30th one of these. Let's then go to Rosamund Darnley, who is a very fashionable dressmaker. Similar character to the one we had in 3-Act Tragedy, actually, which also featured a very fashionable, independent businesswoman and dressmaker. She's Kenneth Marshall's childhood sweetheart, happens to be on holiday at the same time as him on the island, which is a little bit kind of, is it dodgy? Is she positioning herself to be wife number 3?
Initially, she's somebody who Christie's written with quite a bit of affection. I think she has a lot of respect, possibly because she's one of these women herself, for women who've gone out and made their own way in the world and, have earned money, through their own skills.
And I like that. I like that Agatha Christie does admire women with brains, which is good. Emily Brewster, who comes next. I would argue that Emily Brewster is a crypto lesbian, and it's really interesting in the Ustinov film. She's transformed into a clearly very camp gay guy.
Yes.
Agatha Christie describes her as having a voice like a man's. She is gruff and what you call hearty. She rows boats and has a handicap of 4 at golf. I think, though, that she has a good heart. And I'm not saying that to have a handicap of 4 at golf, you are gay, but I think for Agatha Christie, that's probably a telltale sign for her in that era.
Handicap of 4 at golf is pretty good. So
I mean, you'd be a pro, wouldn't you? You'd be a lady professional, I would have thought.
Yeah,
make a bunch of money.
very, very close to it, definitely.
How do you find Emily Brewster?
Not really registered. I think a lot of these characters, they don't get a lot of on-page time, and I think this is probably, it's one of the differences, and maybe one of the downsides of this book compared to the others, in that a lot of these characters are much they're drawn much more shallowly. The characterization that we had in other books, like even the one we had for the nurses back in Sad Cyprus, things like that. A lot of these minor characters don't get this level of characterization in this.
I agree. And because of that, I feel the plot becomes more obvious. Not maybe how it was done, but who did it. Because so many of the characters, A, don't have a motive, and B, there's just not enough attention paid to them for us to write.
I think the thing about the plot as well is it's very difficult for somebody who's seen the movie as a child to sort of be fooled by the plot anyway. We already know what it is, so you're automatically looking for other things. And I do think that if you were coming to this cold, not having seen anything, it would probably, because I do think the plot mechanics are quite clever. I do think it would hook you in more, I think, from that perspective.
I would hope so. So let's round out the guests. We've got Carrie and Odell Gardner, American tourists.
I was wondering about them because I'm almost thinking, is Agatha dropping in Americans to appeal to the American audience here? And they also reminded me, like in Shakespeare, you always have the rustics who are sort of like the comedy characters in the background who don't really have a lot of impact on it.
Although she's softer on them now. Like, I think when she used to drop in Americans before, they were always really crude and crass, new money and gauche. And there's a little bit about that in the Gardeners, but actually it's more comedy just because she does all the talking and he says very little and just goes off and plays golf.
And then Poirot says at the end, he's actually got quite a good sense of humour if you can get him away from his wife.
Exactly.
But I did find that I think Christie, I haven't got any examples of this, but I got the feeling that Christie was using them to drop clues as well.
Yes.
We were talking about this.
Bodies,
Yeah, we were talking about this back in Hercule Poirot's Christmas, and I was like, why do you think the guy who did it mentioned that the key had been turned from outside the lock? And you said it's just Christie needed to get that clue across to the audience. And I get the feeling that Carrie and Odell are there to help give us clues, basically.
Yeah, and I think Emily Brewster's very much in that camp as well. They're sort of plot mechanics delivery devices rather than actual characters.
Yes, definitely.
We get the lovely, rich, loud and bigoted Horace Blatt. But what's interesting is where we've perhaps had bigoted characters in the past, which are just bigoted, and Agatha Christie may or may not be making a point. Here she very much criticizes him for it. He's awful, isn't he? Always saying how rich he is and making those terrible jokes. I think we're very much meant to think that he's horrible. So that's maybe a progression in her personal politics, maybe. We have the Reverend Stephen Lane, who calls Alanna Marshall evil through and through. Hence the title Evil Under the Sun. But of course, our view on Eleanor's going to change, and there's a bit of slut shaming going in on that.
Yes.
We've got Major Barry. And actually, Agatha Christie in general, when we get reverends, she's not very big on religious people in general. I think she finds them quite judgmental and hypocritical. So we've got Major Barry, retired Indian Army, an admirer of women, a teller of long and boring stories. I feel that this is a progression of the Colonel Arbuthnot character. Like, when you start off in her books in the early 20s, like, she quite admires the sort of colonial, dashing, bronzed army officers, and by this point she just finds them all really dull and bigoted.
She's
boring.
been to too many dinner parties and listened to the same stories over and over again.
Exactly. But again, it's another way in which actually her books become, in a sense, more progressive, because she starts seeing through those types. We have a chambermaid called Gladys Narracott, Mrs. Castle, the owner of the Jolly Roger, a woman of 40-odd with a large bust, rather violent henna red hair, and an almost offensively refined manner of speech. So probably someone who's putting on airs Hyacinth Bouquet style, but, another competent businesswoman. So we've got a few of those in this novel. And then the final thing I wanted to say was, maybe we often talk about whether the books are, how they hold up to a modern contemporary reader. And it's kind of interesting that there's no actual proper racism or anti-Semitism that I could find in this book. I think there probably is something a bit sort of, not misogynistic, but patronizing about Kenneth Marshall. But I think we're meant to see it as such. Like, I don't think we're meant to see that as good. What we love the podcast, don't we, all about the Dame, or all about Agatha. Yes. They were very harsh on it for Rosamund Darnley being willing to give up her business for romance, seemingly on a whim. I actually disagree. I don't know how did you find that, without giving away too much of the mechanics of how it happens?
I'm also a little bit disappointed in Rosamund, but I do recognise that was of its time. I think, like, the historical context needs to be taken into account. and the sort of the social norms at the time. And I do think that given the sort of the climate that Rosamund was operating in, she's quite a radical character anyway. I mean, I think Poirot says this. He says something like, you're maybe like 1 in 1,000 women because you've managed to establish yourself independently, you know, and make your own money. I do think it's a lot easier for us to look back at this like 80 years later and say, oh, this is a terrible character. But it was a character of its time.
I agree with you. I do think it's fascinating that Agatha Christie gives so much time to this. Like, there's a very long couple of pages where Poirot and Rosamund talking about her life and her achievements to date. And Poirot, Papa Poirot, who always loves to marry people off, spends a lot of time praising her and saying, like, you know, not 1 in 100 women or 1,000 could have created a business like the one that you have. And it's fascinating to me that the criticism is coming off herself from her. So it's a kind of internalized misogyny where she says, and yet all the same, I'm nothing but an old maid. That's what I feel today at any rate. I'd be happier with 2pence a year and a big silent brute of a husband and a brood of brats running after me. It's half tongue in cheek, but I think there is a truth there. And what I want to say about that passage is I think it's very easy for modern readers, podcasters, anyone to kind of be quite judgmental of her and of the novel and of the time.
Yeah.
But actually, I find this incredibly honest. And I think it's a conversation that modern working women together will have about if they get to 40 and they haven't had kids, that they feel like failures. And wouldn't it be nice just one day to have a man, you know, in a conventional family, not have to explain myself to myself, let alone to others. And I really admire Agatha Christie for putting this in, because I suspect it's a conversation she had with herself. And I think it's a conversation that even contemporary businesswomen who have been raised on the idea that you can have it all, but actually know that it's very, very hard to achieve that, have for themselves and the people they trust.
This is a conversation that she will have had with her first husband, definitely, and possibly with her second husband as well, you know, because of the times that she was living in. I mean,
let's hold the conversation there and come back to it in spoilers, because I will agree with you in the podcast is about something that happens later on. But I think that initial conversation between Poirot and Rosamund is probably, in all of the stuff I've ever read, actually, let alone from this era, one of the most honest conversations about the internal female conflict between
and I think there are
probably and wanting to be married.
There are 2 parts of this section that you've lifted out that I think are very telling. And like the first one is where Poirot turns around and says, "Look, Rosamund, like if you're not married, it's by choice because any man would have you. You know, they've obviously just not been persuasive enough. Whoever you've met, they've just not been right for you because." Like he says, like it is because members of my sex have not been sufficiently eloquent, you know. And then the second part is I do get the feeling like she's almost saying it tongue in cheek, you know. There is a truthness to it, and there is a sadness to it, you know. And I think you're right. I think it is a dilemma that a lot of women, you know, face in modern society, you know.
Okay, let's get into the adaptations and start off with the absolutely glorious. Listener, if you've never seen it, immediately go watch the 1982 Peter Ustinov Poirot film. This came after the 78 Death on the Nile. It stars Dame Maggie Smith, Dame Diana Rigg, James Mason, Sylvia Miles, Jane Birkin. It's a ridiculous cast.
Nicholas Clay playing the devastatingly good-looking Patrick Redfern as well.
Yeah, he's not hard on the eyes. It's filmed in a glamorous Greek island. Everyone looks gorgeous.
Yeah,
they're all in
managed to get
outfits.
his holiday abroad out of the studio again.
I mean, watch this if for no other reason than Ustinov in full bathing kit pretending to go and have a swim. I mean, it's so camp. It's so ridiculous to see Dame Diana Rigg and Maggie Smith just catty going against each other. So Diana Rigg's Arlena, Maggie Smith's Rosamund. It's full of Cole Porter songs. It's just flamboyant and ridiculous and absurd. And
directed by Guy Hamilton as well, of James Bond fame. So.
Absolutely. It's just incredible fun. They do strip some stuff out. There's very little subplot in the actual book, but the subplot there is they take out. Everybody has a motive.
Carrie and Odell become, you know, theatrical agents who Arlena's upset, you know, by pulling out of a show. things like that, which I think the nice touches. They've obviously worked on the script.
Yeah, and it
bit.
actually makes it probably better than the book insofar, which is heresy, because it gives more people a motive.
Yeah.
I really love the casting of the little girl who plays Linda. I think she's tremendous. And we also get one of the most hilarious kind of makeover moments, but I won't say what it is because it'll spoil something, but you can probably guess what it is at the end
Oh
of
yeah,
the
I know what I know what you're talking about, and it is fantastic as well.
Jaw-droppingly good.
So,
I have watched this so many times that I can almost recite it, and it almost blocks out my memory of the book. But I did watch it again this morning after the Japanese Grand Prix, and then I made the fatal mistake of then immediately watching the 2001 Agatha Christie Poirot starring David Suchet. And oh my word!
On the Ustinov one, I would just say I don't think it's quite fair to compare the two, because I do think that that Ustinov adaptation it's played more like a farce, you know, and they've definitely leveraged the comedy angle, which is not there in the original book. The plot is basically the same, and some of the lines are basically the same, but like Ustinov gives a great comic turn in it, and I poor old David Suchet, I don't think is going to be able to
match that.
To match it.
But it's important to say that as many liberties as the Ustinov one makes, with the exception of a swimming cap, it basically is entirely the same plot. So they respect the plot mechanics, but they do play it bigger and more melodramatic and more camp for sure. Have you watched this David Suchet one?
Yes, I watched this especially for this podcast that we're doing.
Oh, bless you. I'm sorry.
I watched it yesterday, and the funny irony as well is you were watching the Japanese Grand Prix, and I was flicking on to watch Match of the Day this morning, and they actually had the David Suchet one on again this morning on
goodness.
ITV3.
Oh, there you go.
But I didn't mind this Suchet one, probably because it's been a while since I watched the Ustinov one. But on the All About Agatha podcast, they said that Suchet it said that this, like being one of the later Poirots, it had been very difficult to sort of recapture a lot of the stuff that they'd done in the earlier ones, and that bits of this, you know, on reflection, he was saying felt tired. And I'll be honest, I didn't get that feeling. I enjoyed the setting. I thought setting on that island was great, and like some of the attention to detail on that island, I thought was fantastic. They must have just got some Art Deco hotel, because
it's set on Berg Island, and in the hotel that actually inspired Agatha Christie to write And Then There Were None. So it genuinely does have a causeway with it when the tide, you know, is in the wrong place.
Yeah, and that tractor that came across, I thought was fantastic. I loved that. But I was sitting there with my sort of builder's eye and going, oh, those are Crittall style windows. They're of the period. You know, and I know that because I've had to buy them for a conservation job, and they cost a fortune now.
And the furniture's all very of the period too. When he's first here, Poirot's bedroom.
So like I thought it, you know, it was quite good. A couple of other plus points for me. I thought Anthony Horowitz writing it, and he's done like a lot of the modern James Bond stuff. I thought that was quite interesting that he's had a hand in the script. I appreciated that. Actually, no, I won't mention that because that will be a spoiler. But I felt that they tightened the plot quite a bit, and some of the credibility issues that the book had, it's sort of like it smoothed them out. You know, where Christie sometimes like leaves a loose end floating. They've written an explanation for that, and it had Hastings Argentine restaurant as well, where Poirot gets poisoned.
You see, I could have done without Hastings and Miss Lemon and Jap and
the Miss Lemon character, I did feel that's where you could sort of like see that the production was getting a bit flabby. You know, I did look at that and think, it's not the best part of the adaptation. But when they got to the island and everything, I thought it was great. The other thing I was going to say about the Argentine restaurant as well is it's not like any Argentine restaurant I've ever been to, because I did spot vegetables on the plate there. So that was like the one flaw I found in that adaptation. But anyway,
I mean, I have to say you definitely enjoyed it more than me. I found it painfully dull, and literally dull. Where the other one is sunlit and gorgeous, I found this to just be absolutely painful. But I'm glad you enjoyed it. So
out of interest as well, I also appreciated as well making the son a boy rather than a girl, which I thought you know, the son of the captain, you know, so they just changed the gender, and I thought that actually helped tighten up the plot slightly as well, because it gave you like somebody else, and another way that the murder could have been committed, things like that. So,
whereas I love Linda as a character, so
she's a great character, and it's fantastic. But anyway, we can talk about it in the spoilers. So.
Absolutely. Is there anything else you want to say before the spoiler part?
No, I think that's everything.
Okie dokie, folks. So with that, we're going to leave you with the end credits music and an invitation to read N or M, a rare Tommy and Tuppence novel, which will be our next episode. In the meantime, we hope you enjoy whatever you're listening to, reading, or watching. And if you do want to know who done it, tune in after the end credits music. Okay, folks, we're back, and we are now going to be spoiler-filled. So to give you the solution to the novel, Patrick and Christine Redfern are in cahoots. They are a very happily married pair of grifters, and they are basically conning Arlena out of her money. Arlena truly believes she's having a passionate affair with Patrick, who's then basically siphoning off the funds from her inheritance from a previous lover. He lured her down to an assignation in the Cove. And to get the timelines and to give themselves alibis, what happened was she was hiding in a cave while Christine Redfern, having applied fake tan, was pretending to be the dead body on the beach. And then he went and strangled Arlena. So they provide each other effectively with the alibis. And it's very similar in that respect to Death on the Nile, where we have a love triangle, but actually you realize that the old lovers are still the lovers. And this is, of course, a trope that Agatha Christie uses time and time again. Back to Mysterious Ferret Styles, Murder at the Vicarage, and even One to Buckle My Shoe, where there's a secret lover that you don't realize. So to me, the novel falls a little bit just on the fact that it's a very rehashed, reused plot. Yeah. And I feel it's just far better done in Death on the Nile. In terms of clues, the clues are no one actually saw the victim's face. So was it really the victim? If everyone has an alibi, the timeline must be suspect, and often is actually in an Hercule Poirot novel. The bottle thrown away, the mysterious bath run at noon, and the scent of perfume in the cave. There aren't that many red herrings in this plot, but I suppose the whole Linda voodoo one is. And there's also a drug smuggling subplot as well, which is a bit poorly done, I think. So it's not big. If you think of Death of the Nile, you had the sort of the theft of the pearls. There was a lot going on there that had to be sort of cleared away before you got to the real murder. Whereas this one, I think, is, as you said earlier, rather thin. What's your feeling on the plot mechanics, the plot credibility, how it all hangs together once we realise what was going on?
I thought it was really tight. I mean, there were a couple of other things just to mention on the clues. I think Poirot makes that comment quite early on, where he's saying like all bodies under the sun look the same. They're all just grilling slabs of meat, And then the other thing as well is that we know it's a man. Like they're very definite about it being a man's hands. And I thought that was quite good in the adaptation, because by, making Linda Lionel, you've given us another suspect. So you've broadened the potential number, because it is quite thin, and you do realize that, there's only, I think they say this in the book, there's only 3 people who could have done it, because we've only got 3 men on the island, and that's it. Exactly. So it narrows the cast down, the sort of the suspect list down quite quickly. But I know what you're saying about it being a rehash and it being a rework, and it is just basically the messing with the timeline, and we do see that quite a bit, and that's why I was almost thinking, was this one of the reasons why it sat on her desk a bit longer than some of the others? Because she had a raft out in the sort of the mid to late 30s that all relied on this, and she'd probably already written this and then been told by a publisher, look, Agatha, you've done it 3 times in the last 12 months. We can't necessarily release this. Can you do something else? So that's the sort of thing I took out. But I thought, like, standalone, if she'd not written anything else in the 30s, we'd all be looking at this going, oh wow, well plotted. It's quite a clever device. I thought it was.
But I'm just wondering if it's a bit over complex in terms of there's so much room for this to go wrong. I was reading some of the reviews at the time, and the one that I really agree with is by someone called Isaac Anderson, published in October 41 in the New York Times Book Review. And he says, The murder is an elaborately planned affair, a little too much so for credibility, in view of the many possibilities of a slip-up somewhere along the way.
Mm-hmm.
Poirot's reasoning is flawless, as it always is. So I kind of agree with him that I do like the intricacy of it, but a bit like Death on the Nile, actually, where there has to be so much like running up and down the side of the boat, and this bullet has to go there.
Yeah, and I think they make this
you
point
know,
on the All About Agatha podcast. They say like the difference between this and Death on the Nile, and what probably gives Death on the Nile the edge, is in Death on the Nile it sometimes goes wrong, so they get spotted, and then they have to kill more people to keep it quiet. Whereas in this, everything goes flawlessly for them.
Apart from the bottle, I guess, because someone almost brain by the bottle. But yeah, absolutely, the stakes are much lower in that respect.
One of the other reasons why I thought this was quite good and why I would put it top tier is I know we sometimes are at loggerheads over how bad Christie's villains are, but I think Patrick and Christina Redfern are probably two of the most loathsome characters that she has written.
Because it's just for money.
But it's not just that. It's the way that they've done it before.
Mm-hmm.
And Poirot says, doesn't he? He says, premeditated strangulation is one of the most sadistic methods of murder because of the pleasure the murderer takes in using their physical strength to exert power over the victim. And I'd never even contemplated that, not even thought of it. And it was quite chilling. When I read, Christie explaining it through the voice of Poirot, I thought, this is right. And he's done this more than once. And he's basically doing it because he enjoys it as well as for the money.
And you sort of feel like they're going to carry on doing it, right? I think that comes across the Ustinov that they are just going to find other women to exploit and do this again and again. Well, as long as his looks hold.
Yeah, and like the other thing as well, I thought like again made me like sort of like go cold shivers over them as villains was the way that they took the opportunity to start setting Linda up as a suspect, because they just took the opportunity. Thought, hang on, we've got a patsy here. Let's push her towards the detectives, and the way that they've all structured that, So, like, I did find them, some of the most horrible people that Christie's written with almost, in fact, I would say this, with nothing to redeem them. I probably put them up there with
Doyle is very much in that category too. He just wants the money and the easy, cushy life and not to work for it. And
but he's not
passionately in love. But I don't ever get the impression that Simon is.
But he's not. He's not strangled people previously. Like he's been caught on his first attempt, or that's as far as we know. Whereas Patrick and Christina have done it at least once, maybe twice before. Out of the few Christies I've read, I think this pair are probably up there with Mrs. Boynton, as sort of like some of the nastiest people that Christie's written.
Agree.
Yes.
And you do get that. I think what's brilliant about the Ustinov is that Christine Redfern makeover at the end.
Yes.
You see the haughtiness and the superciliousness and the contempt with which they hold the mere mortal.
And the transformation. That's what I remember my mum turning around and saying, like when she's walking along looking all dowdy and pasty, my mum in my ear going, "That's Jane Birkin. She's gorgeous. You just wait. We're going to see her later on. She doesn't look like that."
Yes, exactly.
And then she came down with the fantastic hat, and
absolutely stunning.
Yeah, and, immaculately dressed, and you're just like, oh my God, look at that, and then you can see straight away why Patrick Redfern is not serious about his relationship with Arlena. He's, because Christina is fantastically beautiful anyway. And I think it was quite nice. Again, it was like another touch that the adaptation's done and how they've evolved Christie's basic plot, in a good way. It's a good retelling.
As I just said, I mean, I think for me, it's my favorite adaptation. It respects the plot, it respects the mechanics, but it adds so much more.
Definitely.
And it's so much fun. I mean, I watched it so many times. I had a whale of a time watching it again this morning. All right. Well, is there anything else to be said? Maybe a little bit on Rosamund Darley. I mean, we both think she's a very admirable businesswoman, as does Poirot. So at the end, of course, Kenneth Marshall, the rather patronising, stodgy man, is now a widow yet again. Arlen has been murdered. And he says to Rosamund, "You're going to give up that damn dressmaking business of yours and we're going to live in the country." And she says, "Don't you know that I make a very handsome income out of my business? Don't you realise that it's my business, that I created it and worked it up and that I'm proud of it? And you've got the damn nerve to come along and say, 'Give it all up, dear.' I've got the damn nerve to say it, yes. And you think I care enough for you to do it? If you don't, said Kenneth Marshall, you'd be no good to me. Rosamond said softly, oh, my dear, I've wanted to live in the country with you all my life. Now it's going to come true.
Yeah, what I was thinking as I read that was like Agatha's hit the word count, and the publishers aren't getting a penny more out of her. She's not writing any. Just wrap that up for convenience, because there's no way she can be. I mean, she might have had moments where she's thought it would be great just to be a housewife, and as you said in conversations we've had previously about this, like a lot of this probably comes back to her Victorian upbringing, where she could almost expect to be looked after. She would run the house and somebody else would bring the money in so she could run the house. In 21st century reread, it's depressing reading. I think this is a character who we're supposed to respect.
Like a Taming of the Shrew, that you get this very feisty woman who's. It says so much more about Kenneth, that he just cannot conceive of taking a third wife. It just makes me think even worse of him. For her, it is quick, but I do think the only thing that I think justifies it is they were childhood sweethearts. She probably has been dreaming about being Mrs. Kenneth Marshall all her life. She probably didn't dream of being a businesswoman, but had to survive and to have an income. And so this really is her sort of her underlying dream. So I think the way I justify it is you've got to read into it that this is like, if he's in his mid-40s, so she's probably been pining for him for, say, the better part of 30 years, if not more. This is the one bit where I can see why people really hate it, and it does jar with me a little bit too.
and like you've said this when we've talked about books in the past as well, and you've said, I'm not sure how this would have played out. Papa Poirot has wrapped everything up nicely, for the couples on that Nile steamboat, but are their relationships going to last? I'm almost looking at this going, there's another conversation that these two people will be having in a few hours' time, and it will be very different. And Rosamond will be wearing the trousers, and Captain Marshall will be firmly put in his place as he realizes that she's probably earning more money than him. And
I think she's going to get absolutely bored out of her not being married to him. She's just way too impressive a woman.
Definitely. So yes, I thought that I suppose the other thing is I thought I liked thinking about them contrasted, because I think the strongest part of this book for me is Poirot's speech at the end about Arlena Marshall. And it was a real eye opener for me. And I thought for this to be written back when it was written, and for Christie to have sold us on the gold digging aspects, everybody on this island spreads gossip and perpetuates the rumours about Arlena being a gold digger. She's only after people's money. Poirot says, I saw her first, last, and all the time as an eternal and predestined victim. Because she was beautiful, because she had glamour. Yes, because men turned their heads to look at her. It was assumed that she was the type of woman who wrecked lives and destroyed their souls. But I saw her differently. It was not that she was fatally attracted to men. It was men who were fatally attracted to her. She was the type of woman who men care for easily and of whom they easily tire. That's really moving writing. And I thought, comparing that with that, I think that's why Rosamond's statement at the end is so much more of a disappointment, because after Christie's given us this insight, Arlene is this woman who's defined herself by men finding her attractive, and it's led to her death. And Rosamond is doing the same right at the very end. She's going to define her future based on Captain Marshall, and I'm like, it's tragic in a way to read it, and I'm like, oh. That I think that it doubled down on the disappointment for me, because I do think Arlena Marshall is such a tragic character with that statement that Poirot makes, that I think that's what lifts this book for me. Just that one passage, it just moves it into top tier. So
yeah, I agree. I think that there's a real switcheroo going on here, and Agatha Christie knows exactly what she is doing. She is taking what she knows is a readership that is ready to judge a woman like this. And where she's written characters a little bit who would fall into this, like Lord Edgware Dies, where, there's a glamorous woman who has ensnared a rich aristocrat for the money and is very much a gold digger. So she's taking kind of cliches and societal condemnation that she's been on the other side of, and then flips our understanding of who this woman is. and portrays her to be a true victim, not just because she's murdered, but because of how really throughout her life she's just going to be exploited. I think there's a very similar character actually in an Evelyn Waugh novel that's published, well, a little bit later than this, in her Sword and Honor trilogy, where we start off really hating this woman. She's just exploitative and pretty, and she goes after the kind of the aristo guy. But by the end of it, there's no other way to view her but as tragic and as destined to be exploited. And that's why I love this novel, because I think I don't really buy into the plot, although it's very clever and it is a bit padded out. But I just think the way she does Rosamund and Arlena and Linda to a lesser extent, I think are really fascinating. I'm not sure it's that different now. I don't think it's that different to seeing some of the pretty Hollywood starlets who are sort of serially exploited and end up drifting, or, you know, some of the celebrity figures that we see today. That I often see these women in the public eye and think, gosh, you're just never going to be settled because you're always going to be attracting a certain kind of person. Yeah. So, yeah, I find it very moving. I find Arlena very, very moving, actually.
Yeah, and I think that's the one thing I got through on this reread. Like, this was the first time actually reading the book. I've watched the adaptations before, and I've never picked up on this, the tragedy of Arlena Marshall. It's just passed me by. I've skated over it, and I don't think they make it. I think there is room to make another adaptation. Maybe Kenneth Branagh will do it, and if they do, I think there is a lot more to be made of this. You know,
and if you cast someone a little bit younger, right? Because if Kenneth Marshall's in his 40s, she's in her early 30s, right? And I think you could cast someone a bit sort of Taylor Swift age, and you could cast someone who had more of a fragility to her. Because say what you want about Diana Rigg, I mean, she is phenomenal and so beautiful and so charismatic, but she is not fragile.
But it was played very differently as well, because Maggie Smith and Diana Rigg were bouncing off each other, you know, and they were emphasizing the rivalry and the cattiness, and that was part of the humor that was brought to it and the farce, and that was important for that adaptation. And I think if you're going to do another one, you're going to have to do it different, you know, because otherwise you're just going to do a retread. But I do think on this character of Arlena Marshall, there is something to be done here over this this exploitation, to make much more of it, you know. And I think if you miss that opportunity, I think you're right. I think it needs good casting, you know, but there's a meaty character and a great story to be told there that I think is relevant to our times now.
Yeah, I completely agree. You could have someone who could play it with a little bit of fragility. It'd be so powerful. Oh, well, definitely. This has been like such a actually, I didn't even know if we'd have so much to talk about. This has been a really enjoyable discussion. I think it's made me admire the novel more at the end than at the start, which is probably a good thing as well. Yeah.
Well, no, thanks very much for talking it through with me. You know, as always, we're learning new stuff. So, yeah, great.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I look forward to N or M. Again, it's one that it's not by any means a perfect novel, but I think it has so much in it that's kind of interesting. And in that one, particularly about the war.
Well, I'll give it a read, and we'll message about it on the Discord and take it from there. So.
All right. Have a lovely rest of the weekend. Bye.
And you. Okay, bye.